Welcome to this special presentation today. My name is Hal Grodevent, and I direct the Rudd Adoption Research Program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Today, first, I want to acknowledge the gravity of the global conflict that we're seeing unfold in real time today as Russia is invading the Ukraine. It's quite a distressing time for all of us, and I know many of us also find it very distracting. But as I was thinking about this, certainly an interest in adoption heightens the way in which we are all citizens of the world. And so today's talk honors our concern for the world's children and families. So welcome. In 2016, a generous new gift from Andrew and Virginia Rudd established the Rudd Family Visiting Professorship. This professorship was established in order to encourage innovative and collaborative research paths and expand the implementation of the best adoption practices in the US and internationally. Dr. Abbie Goldberg, the Jan and Larry Landry University Professor of Psychology at Clark University, was appointed to this visiting professorship during 2021. And today's presentation provides an overview of the work she conducted with us. She was selected for this position because of her outstanding program of research on adoptive families from diverse backgrounds and her work on the relationship that adoptive families have with their children's schools, acknowledging that children do best when there's an effective partnership between parents and teachers. We are also very proud to note that Abbie is one of our alums, having completed her PhD in clinical psychology in 2005 here at UMass Amherst. Today's presentation is sponsored by the Rudd Adoption Research Program, the Center for Research on Families at UMass Amherst, and the Center for Advanced Practice at Adoption, Rhode Island. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today from a broad array of time zones, countries, and personal and professional connections to adoption. Thank you for joining us. A few words about the format for today's presentation, which is a Zoom webinar. We are recording today's session so that people who were unable to attend can view it later on the Rudd Adoption YouTube channel. You'll also be able to view it again, and we hope you'll also invite colleagues to view it. Dr. Goldberg will talk for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So we will be completing the whole session within the space of 1 hour. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button along the bottom of your screen. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will direct your questions to the speaker. If you experience technical problems during the talk that you think we can solve, feel free to mention it in the chat function. But again, questions for the speaker should be submitted using the Q&A button. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Abbie Goldberg, whose talk is entitled, Adoptive Families in Schools, What Can Parents and Teachers Do to Strengthen Family-School Partnerships and Promote Inclusion? Welcome, Abbie.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. So Rudd, maybe Hal or Jen can just let me know if this comes up. Let's see, 1 second. How's that? Good. Okay, great. So thanks so much for those kind remarks. And I'm so appreciative of all these folks just showing up to learn a little bit during school vacation week, which I think incidentally, maybe more people were able to sign up, which is fantastic. So I'm really excited to share some of the research that I did with the Rudd Adoption Program over my visiting professorship this past year. But I wanted to start by giving a little bit of context for that work and why and how I became interested in sort of teachers' experiences and perspectives. So I've been doing research with adoptive families and specifically running a longitudinal study of lesbian, gay, and heterosexual adoptive families since 2005, so for about 17 years. And we've interviewed these folks many times over the past 17 years, and now we're actually talking to the children. So in the course of that work, I got really interested, understandably, in parents and children's relationships to schools, because, you know, as they were growing up, they were having more experiences and interactions with schools. And of course, schools play a significant role in the lives of all youth, but particularly youth who are from marginalized or less represented identities. So I was really interested in kind of, you know, how parents were navigating school environments, and a little bit, I became interested in sort of what their perspectives were on teachers. So there's not actually very much research on adoptive parents' experiences with schools, but from the work that I've done and a little bit of other work, there's two kind of main themes or main findings that I think are particularly relevant to the work I'm going to talk about today. So first, I found that parents really worried in some cases about revealing too much about their adopted child's background, or even that their child was adopted at all, because they were really concerned about teachers drawing conclusions about their children based on their adoptive status, or sort of in the absence of any real knowledge or training about adoption, that they would kind of, you know, jump to conclusions or kind of use it as a heuristic to draw kind of inferences about their child. So, okay, if the teacher knew that their child was adopted, they would also presume that their child had, say, a trauma history, or if their child had ADHD, teachers would presume that they were in fact drug exposed or something like that. And of course, those things might be true of some adopted children, but they're not true of all. And so here's an example of a quote from a mom who I talked to, who shared this experience that sort of illustrates that this can sometimes come true. So she said, "My son behaved terribly on his first day of preschool. He had a huge tantrum. When I came to pick him up, the teachers all asked whether his biological mom had used drugs, wondering if he had a behavior problem as a result. I understand the reason for this question, but it was jarring that they immediately wanted to label him with a behavior problem because of being adopted." So in some cases, these concerns, these fears did in fact come true. Teachers did in fact draw sometimes inappropriate conclusions about their children. Another big finding was that parents often felt like they really needed to advocate at an extra level for their adopted children. So because they were encountering insensitivity, say in kind of curricula or kind of classroom materials that sort of implicitly or explicitly marginalized or didn't include their families or children, you know, kind of assumed that all children were biologically related to their children, all parents in turn had been pregnant with their children, and so on. They, you know, said, you know, we donate materials, we, you know, talk to the teachers, we do all this extra education. And they talked a lot about how they had this took time and this took work. In particular, a number of parents said that teachers really lacked any kind of in-depth understanding of open adoption. This was quite foreign to many teachers, and a number of parents said teachers made sort of not even insensitive, but sort of clearly inappropriate remarks to them about the effects of open adoption on children. So why is your child seeing their birth mother? That seems dangerous, or that seems like a bad idea, or that must be confusing for your child. Here's a couple of quotes from participants along these lines. "We need to do education about how adoption is not rescuing a child. We've already gotten one comment from a teacher that shows this common misconception. The biggest hurdle is explaining our fully open adoption and relationship with birth family." So through this work, I got really interested in what are teachers' perspectives, right? So I clearly have a sense of what parents are afraid of and some of the challenges they're experiencing. What are teachers experiencing? So research on teachers and adoption is pretty limited. Just a couple of studies, mainly qualitative, most of them older. And what this work shows is that teachers, by and large, lack training on adoption. And in the absence of any real training, they feel really ill prepared to handle adoption-related issues as they arise. And so they often rely on colleagues, or also lack training, and others like parents for input and support, right? So a key challenge then is that teachers may lack in-depth knowledge or training on adoption, and really don't have a sense of the incredible diversity among adopted children. Maybe they know one adopted child, or they think they do, or maybe they just know what they've learned from the media or their own personal lives. And so they're really potentially vulnerable to missteps, such as making, inferences about adopted children that are not appropriate, or not taking adopted children into account when designing curricula, or potentially relying on colleagues' advice, which again may not be evidence-based. So some of the central questions that my work and the limited literature led me to formulate concerned, teaching preparation. How equipped do teachers feel? How much training do they have in the area of adoption? What are their experiences teaching adoptive families and children? What challenges do they encounter? What successes and strategies do they report? But then backing up, how do they even find out that children are adopted in the first place, and from whom do they tend to learn that information? And then finally, how do they regard parents themselves, particularly given that parents tend to be doing a lot of advocacy? So to answer these questions, I, as well as Hal, became kind of put our heads together to develop a survey for teachers. And so informing this survey were a series of focus groups that I conducted with both parents and teachers. So I did 2 focus groups with parents and 2 focus groups with teachers. And that information informed the development of the survey, as well as the prior literature. And then our survey was reviewed by some experts and advocates in the field. And we sent it to various online means. We received responses from over 200 teachers, paraprofessionals, and other school professionals. So pretty well represented among elementary school, secondary school, special ed. And as you'll see, a broad representation of grade levels and subject matter areas was achieved. So here's just the sort of teaching areas. You can see, some folks also taught multiple areas, but special ed, general elementary, English, language arts, languages, math, science, and social studies, with less than 10% in other areas like music or IT and things like that. Computer science, etc. And as you can see, a nice representation of different grades that folks taught was also achieved, and many folks taught multiple grades, of course. The sample was mostly women who were mostly white and mostly in their 30s and 50s, which is actually pretty similar to the kind of modal teacher in the United States. They taught in 26 different states. Almost 3/4 had a master's degree, and most had been teaching at least 11 years, with just 3% teaching under a year. And most of them taught at public schools. Okay. So some of our findings. So when asked about sort of any formal teacher training or education or professional development related to adoption, adopted families, only 15% reported receiving anything about adoption during their education or during any professional development. And then they were asked whether their teacher training addressed a variety of issues related to adoption. And I'm going to list those on the next slide. And so between 3 to 12% said they'd ever reported learning about any of these. So these are just some of the areas, but common issues among adopted children, like identity or attachment issues, loss and grief, educational needs and issues, different types of adoption. So adoption routes, private, public, international. I believe this was like the lowest endorsement. Very few people had received any knowledge about this. Awareness of adoption when developing curricula, knowledge of the potential for trauma in adopted children, how it might affect classroom behavior or need for accommodations, like the fact that some kids struggle with routine, awareness of assumptions about adoption. For example, assuming that a child of a different race is from somewhere else. Elements of family diversity that might overlap with adoption, like multiracial families or LGBT parent families, and managing relationships with birth families. So again, 3 to 12% of folks said, yes, I learned about this as part of my education. Okay. So importantly, many teachers said that learning about these areas would have actually been very helpful to them. So quickly, before I get to there, this is just sort of illustrates what I was just saying, which is that only 2.4% of folks said that they were actually very prepared to work with adopted children and families, with 24% saying somewhat prepared and most saying, not very or not at all. What's clear here is that they're feeling like they're getting some training on the job just through working with adoptive families, or maybe through their own life experience as adoptive parents, or perhaps they're seeking out reading materials and other information, because when asked how prepared they feel now, most are saying somewhat or very. So there's a huge discrepancy between how prepared they felt they were, after their training, and how prepared they feel now. Now, we don't really know if they really are prepared, but they feel prepared, right? So now what I was going to say is, we asked them, do you think that this would be helpful to teachers, to new teachers? And 70 to 85% said that learning about each of those issues would be very helpful to new teachers. So they said things like, I never learned about adoption while getting my degree and certification to become a teacher. I feel really ignorant about issues related to adoption. It hasn't been addressed in all the years of diversity work I have done. This is kind of unbelievable to me. I've learned a lot, but because of my life, not because of any class, literally 0 classes. But I do a lot of reading and thinking about these kinds of issues. And another person said, I'm realizing that my curriculum does not really highlight the voices of adopted children or adults, which is a huge oversight and also a missing piece in thinking about the nuances and complexities of racial and cultural identity. Okay. So of interest is kind of basically, how might we integrate this kind of learning into curriculum? And a lot of these folks endorse various barriers to learning about adoption. So we said, so what kinds of problems or what sorts of issues do you think might prevent teachers from being able to learn about these things in the context of, say, professional development? And, we gave them a bunch of options, and the top sort of endorsed reasons were teacher time constraints, lack of interest from the school or district, and lack of funding. So these were seen as the 3 sort of primary structural barriers or kind of factors preventing folks from learning about adoption, followed by teacher lack of interest, a training program lack of interest, and schools' fear of parent backlash. So this challenge remains, which is, how are we going to incorporate this information into teacher training if so many barriers exist, as these teachers are telling us they believe they do? And I think they're right, that there are all these barriers to incorporating this. But I have some ideas that I'll talk about later about how this might be done. Okay, so moving on to think about how these teachers actually learned that a child was adopted. I think that's a really worthwhile thing to kind of understand, given so many parents' concerns about sharing that information. So when we think about, there we go. When we think about sort of how participants found out that a child that they were teaching was adopted, many of them said that they learned this from the child themselves, followed by the parents, followed by other teachers, which is quite interesting, that this information is being sort of shared among teachers, followed by support staff, paperwork in the context of an individual education plan or 504 meeting, followed by parents' email, followed by child's behavioral or emotional issues, which prompted the disclosure about a child's adoptive status. Child assignment, so in the context of, say, writing an essay, a child disclosed that they were adopted or revealed that, and then other ways. And interestingly, in the other category, there were some folks that said, well, I know they're adopted because they're a different race than their parent, which again, may not be true. So in some cases, they may be making this conclusion erroneously. Many of them said that there really was no formal system for gathering or disseminating about a child's background, including adoptive status. So some of them said, yeah, there's a general background form with questions like, is there anything else you'd like us to know? that is sent out either by the school or by the teachers. But in a lot of cases, teachers did not know if such a form was even sent. 37% were actually not sure if such a form existed where this information might be shared. Only 40% said that they knew that this type of form, this, a form where you could report this if you wanted to, was actually sent, and 22% that no such form was sent. So we were interested in, did you ever want to know more about a child's background, adoptive background, once you knew that they were adopted? And almost half said yes. They thought that this information would be helpful to them in making a meaningful connection to the child, in some cases because they themselves were adopted or because they were an adoptive parent and they felt like that would help to make a connection. They also felt like knowing more would help them to better educate and serve these children, perhaps assume a trauma-informed approach, maybe anticipate issues that might come up for the child, like recognizing that birthdays might be loaded or challenging, for example. But they, in many cases, did not seek out information, did not ask parents about, for more details, because they were very concerned, appropriately, about boundaries, and they didn't want to overstep, they didn't want to upset or offend parents, and they weren't really sure how to ask about that information. So, when parents said, I often want to know more about children's history in a lot of areas, including adoption, but generally don't ask unless a family offers. So many of them sort of voice this tension between wanting to know that a child was adopted or more about a child's adoptive history, and wanting to respect the boundaries and privacy and not alienate families, right? So now I'm going to turn to what teachers did to be more inclusive of adoptive families. But before I do, I want to briefly address kind of the emotional experience of adoption for children and how it's relevant to schools. So children who are adopted are very diverse, right? In the extent to which they experience emotional, behavioral, or developmental challenges. Some work suggests that adopted children are more likely to have, for example, special needs, developmental challenges, ADHD, but these challenges are more common among children who were adopted at a later age and or who have a history of trauma or abuse. But regardless of age or sort of trauma history, children tend to become more aware of their adoption and what adoption means and sort of the nuances of adoption as they grow older, as they kind of make their way through school. And as others begin to kind of inquire about their adoption, their learning is more likely to be impacted by the emotional experience of adoption. And I think what's important to recognize is that kids are getting older, they're adopted, they know they're adopted, their understanding of adoption is becoming more nuanced and layered. And they're surrounded by kids often who really know very little about adoption, whose understanding of adoption is largely based on, if they don't have anyone in their life, who's adopted, on media. And the dominant media depictions of adoption are pretty simplified and really tend to be very one-dimensional. They're very dramatic, or they're very simplified. They often center loss, abandonment. And, in this context, adoption competence by teachers is incredibly important. And if teachers also lack understanding, and their understanding of adoption is primarily, kind of what's in the either, right, what's out there or what they've seen in the media, that's a troublesome combination. So adoption competence is really quite important. So moving on to what teachers said that they were doing to be more inclusive of, or had done to be more inclusive of adopted children and families, 70% said that they had adopted more inclusive language. So for example, using inclusive terms for parents and caregivers, like your grown-ups, your adults at home, for example. They avoided the use of adopting when referred to things like, fundraising, sponsorships, adopting shelves, adopt a highway, things like that. They avoided terms like real parents, given up for adoption, and used more adoption-aware language like biological parents, placed for adoption. And they purposely employed expansive language So, you know, some people have two moms, some people have two dads, some people have one parent, some people have two, some people have three, some people are adopted, some people have, you know, are not. So they kind of use more expansive language in which adopted children or families were just one of a number of types of families. Here's a quote from a teacher who said, every year the phrase real family comes up in conversation for one reason or another. We usually take time to unpack that. Biological parent siblings does not always equal real family. I usually press students who consider that they don't get to decide who someone else's real family is. I thought that was pretty powerful. So numbering's all off. So before I kind of tell you about, oh, here's one more quote. I tend to assume that I have adopted children in class, so I use language that would be most appropriate. I don't assume that a student's struggle is related to being adopted. If I need to know, I assume the student or parents will inform me if they feel it is necessary. So before I tell you about sort of modifications teachers made to their assignments, it's first worth saying what sort of areas they thought were most challenging for adopted children. So by and large, anything related to sort of family tree, history, heritage, anything that involved bringing in baby photos, these were identified as pretty troublesome for adopted children. They have taught anything related to discussion of traits, DNA, genes, physical resemblances, really all these things related to biology and health. Any discussion or assignments that highlighted immigration, personal identity, personal sharing about family, particularly around traditions and culture, early childhood memories, especially those that might involve grief or loss, how children got their name, as well as other decisions that parents make when children are young or when they're having a baby, and reproduction and pregnancy. And here's a quote that I thought was very, very powerful. Anything that involves a baby picture or includes or focuses on loss. For many adopted kids, books, movies, and themes that are appropriate for others, their age are not for them. Even Moana calling out mom, dad, and that one tiny little scene when she's having a nightmare can stay with a child who's experienced the loss of a parent for a very long time. So in line with these challenges, the kinds of changes that they made to assignments were to really emphasize or differentiate the difference between social and genetic parenthood when they're dealing with genetics, DNA, family history assignments. So it's not mom and dad, but it's material from egg and a sperm. Modifying family history assignments and family tree assignments. So either saying you could use anyone in your family that you consider family, or avoiding these kinds of assignments altogether, avoiding Mother's and Father's Day celebrations, doing something like maybe Parents or Important Adults Day, or providing options to choose from, and just staying away from baby photo assignments or contests. If a photo is to be brought in, it's usually a photo that's from earlier in your life or a photo that's special to you, not a baby photo in particular. Couple of quotes. When assigning work where students reflect on families, I try to be explicit about chosen families and non-biological families. For example, if students are asked to trace the story of how their family got to San Francisco, I make it clear that students can pick anyone they consider to be family. I have a dominant recessive allele assignment that I ask kids to talk with a relative about, but everyone has the option to talk to non-related people too. I never single out any students for modified assignments. Finally, with respect to books and materials, teachers avoided books or music that narrowly celebrated or defined one type of family. They displayed, assigned, and discussed books and materials that highlighted diverse families. They also tried to assign films and books where adoptive families were sort of centered or a main part, not just sort of a side theme. They also highlighted local heroes and celebrities who were adopted. They avoided books and materials that negatively stereotyped adoption or adopted people that kind of were, you know, sort of celebrating or romanticizing the kind of orphan experience, i.e. Annie, or villainizing adoption. Now, here's a quote that I think is very important when we think about the limits of these modifications. One teacher pointed out that the issue with modifying assignments is that it only underscores the ways in which the child's experience is different than the expected norm. There is no reason to have any assignment that requires modification. All assignments should be created and delivered in ways that honor and lift up everyone, not require modification in order to fit what is perceived to be the normal lens. Such a thoughtful quote about, really creating assignments and curricula where everyone from the outset is sort of included and celebrated, and everyone can participate equally in their education. Finally, with respect to disciplinary practices, 43% said that they use trauma-informed or restorative practices, things like calming boxes, sensory breaks, zones of regulation, guidance passes to help children when they're struggling, using positive reward, practicing tolerance and empathy. Many teachers talked about recognizing behavior is a form of communication, so they tried to respond to that behavior with kind of an investigative lens, trying to figure out what was going on as opposed to punishment. It's sort of the detective kind of versus being kind of a cop approach. And then working closely with school supports and counselors. Here's just a couple of quotes. Understanding the root cause of the behavior is key when handling discipline, which includes knowledge of children's adoption and trauma history. I try to use trauma-informed practices in any disciplinary situation. I sit next to students and at the same level as them instead of across from them and or standing while they're seated when I talk to them about their behavior. I try to ask questions as much as possible. So again, that detective, not a cop stance. And then the final area that we were interested in was sort of teachers' experiences or perceptions of parents. How did they feel about adoptive parents, involvement in advocacy for their children? 76% said they very much welcomed it. 22 said that they welcomed it. And just 2% were neutral. Nobody said that they didn't want parents to be involved. And they viewed parent engagement and communication as key, particularly when we're talking about adoptive families. So they felt like parent engagement was great, and they really valued and were appreciative of the feedback they got. It's helpful to me as an educator, one said, when adoptive parents come to me and let me know what their child's needs are. I want to be as accommodating and inclusive as possible in my classroom, and I can't do that if I'm not aware of what's expected of me as an educator and advocate for the adopted child. I consider the relationship I have with my families as a partnership where we work together for what's in the best interest of the child. Now, minority of parents did report some experiences with parents where they felt like parents were not as maybe adoption aware or trauma sensitive as they could be. Specifically, they felt like sometimes parents were not sort of advocating for their children in the best particular way. And they said that they were kind of insensitive to certain dynamics and issues. So they weren't understanding, for example, why their child might be angry or struggling with issues of abandonment. One said, unfortunately, I've had adoptive parents that clearly don't recognize, validate, or understand the effects of adoption trauma on a child. They are welcome to give input, but sometimes it is difficult because they are not going about things in what is the best manner for the child. They didn't feel like parents were necessarily the best advocates for their children. So I want to just end with a couple takeaways. I think what's clear from these data is that it's best to take a proactive rather than reactive stance with respect to adoption inclusion, that ultimately truly inclusive language and practices will encourage openness by parents and children. It will really serve all families. It's important to normalize adoption as just part of the diversity that children and families bring to school. And real inclusion actually benefits all students, not just adopted students. Likewise, trauma-informed teaching can help all students, not just students who are adopted or in foster care. But it's clearly a fine balance between anticipating that issues might be related to adoption and not assuming that they are. And clearly it does take training, and it does take exposure to more than one adopted family to become a bit more savvy and a bit more more, restrained in terms of the conclusions that one might draw. I think it's important to encourage school administrators to try to find ways to incorporate education on adoption competence into existing professional development. So thinking creatively about, where this information might go. Maybe it would go in sort of trauma responsive classroom training, or in the context of learning about social emotional learning or diversity and inclusion training. There's clearly a need to share information across support teams so that folks who need this information get it, and it's not just left to kind of hallway conversations or when people feel like it might be important. And very clearly, parent-teacher communication and collaboration is key. So I'm happy to get into more and hear all of your thoughts about this, but I wanted to just highlight a couple of resources. So the report in which some of these findings are summarized is on the Rudd Adoption Research Program page. We've also compiled a bunch of different adoption resources. So there's information about trainings, other resource documents, reports, clearinghouses, even some videos. Here's just a couple. We've listed the case educational trainings for parents and professionals, suggestions for teachers working with adopted children. These are some of our favorites. We've just kind of provided these things in one place. I also want to point out a website that I developed called Teach All Families, and it is a website specifically for teachers and parents and school administrators to make their schools more inclusive of LGBT parent families, but a lot of these tools really are for all families. They're how to become more inclusive of all kinds of families. And I want to just say that I am currently in the process of working with some schools to do kind of these learning circles or discussion circles with teachers who want to use the materials and are trying to use the materials that are in this particular website or resource. And they want to talk about it, and they want to get input, they want to get feedback, they want to talk to other teachers who are trying to make their schools and classrooms more inclusive of LGBT families and children. So if folks have connections to schools or who want to schedule something, they can get in touch with me. But my goal right now is to actually, as you can see here, do more dissemination of these findings. So all of these tools are evidence-based. There's tips for language and curriculum and paperwork that, again, can be kind of useful in rethinking how we include all kinds of families in schools. And then here are the references, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So Abbie, it looks like we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I can read them out for you, or if you want to read them, either way is totally fine to me.
Yeah, it would be great if you could, and then I can think about them as you're reading them.
All right. So the first question is, what suggestions do you have for educators to help other students understand diverse families, as they might notice differences through transracial adoptions or intergenerations? Specifically, this person was thinking about grandparents caring for children. So kind of about family structures.
Okay. So educators, okay, right. Okay. Yeah, I think it's interesting too, right? Because if we're thinking about like grandparents, there's also generational differences. And so I think one of the things that I've been sort of noticing is that, as an example, open adoption or transracial adoption might be less familiar to people who are several generations removed. Right now, I think these are really kind of unusual constructs for people who are maybe in their 70s, say, raising children. The whole idea of open adoption kind of blows some people's minds. So I think in trying to help educators, or for educators trying to help families, or honestly for educators themselves, I think the key thing to be talking to them about is, I mean, this is just my bias, but always talking about the research. What do we know? How are things maybe different now than they used to be? So with open adoption, I often start with people, including people in my own family, who just find this to be such a strange notion, to say, there's a lot of research, and this is actually what we know about the effects of keeping secrets or people not having access to information about their birth family. And, isn't it great that we know so much more and we can make changes in how we do adoption so that we can, hopefully make this, a better experience for everybody. So it's sort of like acknowledging sometimes, I think, starting with the place of like, I understand how this can be hard and challenging and confusing. And here are the sort of some of the tools, or here is some resources to read to better understand, why this matters. So in the case of transracial or transcultural adoption, why does this matter? How can you be more inclusive? To really give them a chance to recognize that, in their eyes, the world maybe has changed, or things are different than they might assume. And it's just really about learning and getting up to speed. I don't know if that's helpful, but trying to address a lot of different pieces.
No, it was perfect, because the next question too, it kind of lends itself to those same topics as well. So the next question is about a child's privacy preferences. So this person would like to just kind of share a little background. They said, I'm recalling a widely read author who had a blog post in which she shared a letter she would send to her daughter's teacher explaining how her adoption background could show up on her classroom behavior. And later, her daughter expressed embarrassment that the details about her adoption were made public, and the author ended up removing the post. So the person who sent this question would like to know, how should child's privacy needs be considered when making decisions about information educators need to meet the children's needs in the classroom?
Such a good question. And I think there's like no clear answers. Like there's no like everyone should do this and starting at this age, because I think that's why these data are so complicated around disclosure and sharing. On the one hand, there's so many benefits to a well-trained teacher having access to that information. That's the point I really want to drill home, that like in the absence of education, this information could be really dangerous and could be really misused. And that's what parents are appropriately afraid of. So that's why we need adoption training, so that parents don't have things to be afraid of. But privacy concerns are legitimate. And I think we have to take into account a couple of things. One is the developmental status of that child. So, how old is this person? As children grow older in general, we want them to have more sort of access to information and to be able to have more autonomy in determining who gets what information. Do you want your teachers to know A, B, and C? Okay. You don't want them to know. Okay, right? That's an appropriate question for a teenager. It may not be an appropriate question for a 5-year-old. So parents have to really do their best, make their best guess about how could this information be beneficial, exactly how much information to offer. So, okay, I'm going to share with you that my child is adopted. My child has regular visits with her birth mother. So if she talks about another person and she says my birth mother, I want you to be sensitive and aware and not confused, and not make my child think that there's something to be ashamed of or that that's strange. And I'm going to do a little education with you about that. Thinking about what are the pieces of information that this teacher needs to know, and then maybe asking questions about how is this information shared. I'm telling you as my child's first grade teacher that my child is adopted, that that these are the ways in which this might show up. Now I would like to know where this information is kept, who will have access to it. And I think being we have to kind of investigate that and do that a little bit more work there. But I think it will help to prevent this kind of situation where, children and or parents are upset about how this information is being used. So asking more questions, and also schools could be better about giving that information too. How is this information being used? Who has access to it? When and why?
So there's a couple of questions that I'm going to group together that all have a similar theme about adoption trauma. So kind of thinking about the social and friends, the challenges that go on with students that seem to stem from adoption trauma, and then emphasizing to teachers that kind of all adoption comes with some sort of trauma, loss, or grief. And then how do you encourage buy-in from the staff and administrators that this type of training is necessary when they may feel like they already have received some sort of trauma training that maybe isn't specific to adoption?
Okay. Okay, I'm just looking. Okay. So with respect, I hope I'm getting all of it, but with respect to like asking for buy-in, I mean, I think I would probably start, if you were going to advocate for a school administrator and you're going to say, okay, yeah, we got this trauma training, but adoption trauma is unique and how we handle that is unique. There are all kinds of complicated ways that trauma, you know, it's interlayered with adoption. And also it shows up in so many different ways that are nuanced by adoption, right? Loss and grief and having had multiple caregivers, you know, abuse, neglect, if those things are present, they have a different meaning if, you know, you're living with parents that didn't give birth to you and or have lived in multiple foster care situations, or you have a difficult visit with a birth relative, right? And then you come to school. Where all of these, I think it's hard to imagine a person who has a lot of trauma training, but with no adoption training, really understanding and responding in an authentic way to that child in a lot of situations, right? They may be able to see the behavior and know how to handle the behavior, but they may hold certain ideas about adoption that are really either archaic or potentially damaging, or just not understand the connections between different things in ways that an adoption aware approach could. I hope that helps.
Yeah, the next question actually goes along with that very well, that this person wanted to know, how can adoptive parents best explain splintered growth to teachers and administrators? How can we prevent them from pigeonholing our adopted children / students in terms of their academic and life success?
I mean, I think the general response that I would give there is this idea of really driving home, and again, this would happen in the context of an adoption training, this idea of diversity, right? That there is not one adoption story, that we can have a general idea about how, you know, loss might show up or trauma might show up, or, you know, elements of adoption might show up for a child, but that we really don't know. And so that again, the fact that 3 to 12% of folks, you know, I would think it was really 3% who didn't even know about the different kinds of adoption. You know, you don't know about private domestic and public domestic and international. You don't know anything much about child, you know, foster care or open adoption or, you know, transracial adoption, right? That to me, there's just so many gaps that the biggest thing is understanding the diversity among, and then the next step is really understanding all of the different threads and how they might affect a child or a given family. I know that's pretty broad, but I think that the idea here is that there is no one adopted child. There's no one adopted family. And so we can have these general sort of lessons or teachings, but it just comes back to, you know, adoption training needs to be more than an hour. Because I think that's just potentially going to reinforce some of what these parents were concerned about, you know, that a teacher thinks that they're aware of adoption, but they really don't know very much at all.
So this person wanted to know if you had any specific recommendations for an older teen that's struggling with the issues around loss and grief and struggling in school as a result, that the child doesn't want the teachers to know about things in the past and being adopted, and it's presenting as a barrier to their learning and understanding.
Yeah. So two things. First would just be that child deserves, you know, a space where they can be fully themselves, right? And so whether that's in the context of support group, online, in person, therapy, some place where they really can feel that they can let their guard down, and the person has access to all of that information. The fact that they feel, understandably maybe, to kind of keep that part of themselves hidden who's at school. Again, that's sort of in line with a lot of sort of normative developmental issues, that adolescents want to keep certain aspects of their life private. If there was one teacher or one person, maybe a counselor at school, who had access to that information, that would be, I think, tremendously beneficial. But it would have to be a person that teen identified as a trusted adult who they could access at school if they were having trouble. But I do think that it would be beneficial to have at least, again, one person who they felt comfortable with, who had that information. And so if they were struggling, they felt comfortable to talk to somebody who knew their full story. But I think it's important. I mean, I'm just obviously a believer in therapy and support. And I think that there needs to be a place or a space for that child to, to not feel like they have to kind of pick and choose parts of their identity that they share. But I think honoring privacy and that request for privacy is something to take seriously with all teenagers. And clearly they perceive some risk to disclosing that in kind of a global way to schools.
And there's a couple of questions about your research and your data specifically. So were there any teachers in the survey that were identified as members of the adoption triad, so adoptee, birth parent, or adoptive parent? And then secondly, if during your research, did you find any specific differentiation regarding teaching children in foster care versus those experiencing adoption? Yeah.
So I'm glad that you asked that. What was probably one of the most interesting parts about the sample was that over 20, something like 20, I'd have to go back and look, but 21 maybe % of respondents were adoptive parents, which is really interesting. So I think, certainly they were more adoption aware than many folks. As for, the number of them who were adoptees or had other adopted people in their lives, it was less than that, maybe somewhere between 5 and 15% maybe for them being adoptees. I don't remember the numbers offhand, but I can certainly get them. But it was very notable that 20-something% were adoptive parents themselves. And then regarding foster care versus adoption, we struggled because we initially constructed the survey to refer to both separately, like kids in foster care, kids who are adopted, and it was just too complicated. And honestly, I think everyone would have just, given up. So we really made it focused on adoption, but many folks did sort of respond talking about their experiences with children who were in foster care. I just think that context is very different, and the kinds of issues that come up are really, really different. So I think there needs to be a lot more research in that area as well. It just seems like a lot to try to capture in one particular survey.
And I think we may have time for one, maybe two more questions. Is there any book or research you would suggest that discusses a birth parent dying? A few of us have recently experienced this, especially this year after adoptions were finalized, and it's really hard to explain the impact to teachers and to other family members.
It's a great question. There's a bunch of different studies that have sort of incidentally discussed this, but I don't know that there's a specific book or any book-length resource. I know that it's been discussed in the context of major events to do with birth family, so a birth family member dying or disappearing. I'd love it if people would just type in the chat if they actually know of anything that would be helpful there, because it's definitely something that has come up in my research quite a bit. And all I'll say is that when a birth family in my sample has died and the family is struggling, it has really been beneficial for the folks in their life who were who knew about those relationships. They could understand the impact of the death to a greater extent. So my point being is that if teachers are already aware of you're in an open adoption and this child has contact with the birth family, they're going to understand the resonance of that to a greater degree. But I'm not sure, maybe Hal knows if there are some resources for sort of talking about that. So I'll let, maybe you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm really not aware of any particular resources, but I would echo your comment that if people are aware of any, please put them in the chat and we can share that information more broadly afterwards.
I think it's a really important question and a really important area, because it's another one of those. I'm very interested in unacknowledged losses and invisible losses, and I think it's a form of loss that means different things to different people, but most people would never really think of it, in the general public, and they wouldn't recognize the impact that would have. And in some cases, a birth parent, say in my research, has died, but the child has never actually met that birth parent. So that is always an interesting challenge to sort of how and when do you talk about that? It's a loss, but it's a loss that means something different if it goes from, if it's even more ambiguous in that context.
So I think Hal was going to say a few words to wrap up. There's a few questions that are still in the Q&A that we will download those, and Abbie's been said she's willing to answer those questions. So when we send out the recording, we'll make sure that those questions are also included in there so you can see those responses. And also if there's other resources, we'll add those in there as well.
Well, thank you. And I just want to give a great thanks to Abbie for a wonderful presentation and really thoughtful responses, and to say it was really a pleasure to work with Abbie over the course of her visiting professorship. And just to comment that all of it was done virtually because it was all in the midst of the pandemic, and we never actually met. We've met face to face many times before, but we never actually met face to face during the course of her residency. So it was a great experience, and I'm glad we had the technology to do it. I also want to give special thanks to Amanda for really orchestrating all of the technology that we're using, and to Jen Dolan for her help with all the aspects of trying to recruit participants and gather information together. Thanks, Jen. And thank all of you for coming today. It's the middle of a weekday, and we're really glad you were able to be here and we see people from all over. We're so glad that you were here. So feel free to add additional comments or questions, and encourage people to watch this video later on. We'll have it on our YouTube channel. And
I was just sending my email through the chat. Folks can reach out to me at any point. I would be happy to have more conversations or collaborate in any way. And you're all so very welcome. And I really appreciate all of you.
Great. Thank you very much.